Chapter 23.
Why even bother to forbid it?
Alice asked.
It might as well be called the zone you don't want to go to anyhow.
Except we're balmy enough to make that our destination,
Steve said.
I'm going to set us down as close to the entrance as possible.
Why not fly over? The Colonel said. Perform some recon.
This particular zone, Steve said, is of the forbidden variety. The field that keeps the Confederation citizens from entering also produces an electromagnetic pulse into the airspace. If we fly over, we'll crash.
Let's not fly over it, I said.
Yeah, I'm for landing,
Steve agreed. Good idea, I told him. We set down the ship about a quarter mile from the Forbidden Zone entrance, gathered our supplies, and began to march towards the last place any of us wanted to go. The area just outside the Forbidden Zone may not have been forbidden, but it wasn't particularly welcoming either. It was a lot of scrub and loose stone, but it was still a lot more hospitable than the rolling dunes and gigantic outcroppings of rock that lay before us. The air here was already much warmer than Confederation Central Standard, but at least the surrounding terrain was deserted, which meant no one was trying to kill us. Yet. Everyone grabbed their packs, and we began moving towards the desert. No one had to state the obvious, that Junip's peace officers would know where we'd gone, and they'd be hot on our heels. We had to get across the border before they overtook us. If we didn't, all of this would have been for nothing.
How do we find what we're looking for?
Alice asked as we trudged along.
There's miles and miles of desert out there.
I have a map, I said. I opened up the file the Bush had given me. It was encrypted with a series of questions that only I was supposed to be able to answer. I had to input the classic 7-hero Justice League lineup, the serial number of the Enterprise from Next Generation, and the names of all the actors who played the Doctor. I struggled, understandably I think, with number 7, but typed Sylvester McCoy and all was good. A rough map resolved. It wasn't long on detail, but it would get us moving in the right direction. I hoped. Everyone peered at the map projecting from my data bracelet.
That looks pretty vague,
said the Colonel.
Yeah,
agreed Alice.
I'm not sure I'd have signed off on the plan if I knew that was all we had to go on.
I couldn't argue with what they were saying. Dr. Roop thought this would be enough. If he didn't think we could find it, he wouldn't have sent us. I took a look at the skies behind us, still no signs of pursuit.
I can help you find the hidden fortress, Smelly said.
I told Dr. Roop about Smelly. Had he known the AI would be able to help us? Was that why he hadn't bothered to tell me more? Or maybe the fortress would be easy to find, and it would soon become obvious why he hadn't given us explicit instructions. I was lost in these thoughts as we walked. And then, suddenly, we were at the point where the open area of the station ended, and the restricted area began. The boundary to the Forbidden Zone was a thick green line painted across the ground, partially covered with drifting piles of sand. Every few feet there were signs warning us we couldn't cross. It sort of reminded me of Area 51.
What happens if we step over the line and explode?
Misan asked. That would be bad, I suggested.
She raises an excellent point, Volonic said. It may not be safe. I strongly urge that we turn back to Junip and beg for his mercy.
I didn't say anything. I didn't want to strain things any more than I had to with Tamrat. I hoped one of the others would pick up the slack for me.
It is well for you to say, Charles told him. You are still hoping to be sent back to your world with no consequences. You have already seen Junip attempt to kill you, and yet you do not learn. But now you're one of us. You've stolen a shuttle, and there's no way to go but forward.
And so saying, Charles stepped over the line, and he exploded. There was a bright flash of light, and a plume of ashes mushroomed into the air, as fragments of what had once been Charles drifted upwards.
I'm totally messing with you,
Smelly said. Before I had a chance to react to Charles exploding, my vision changed, and there he was on the other side of the line, shrugging. "Don't ever do that!" I shouted, before I could control myself.
Someone had to go,
Charles said, looking at me like I was crazy. Misan put a hand on my shoulder as she walked past me. Chill, she said, and then she stepped over the line. She did not explode. I gritted my teeth. My heart was still pounding, and my stomach was somewhere up in my throat. I tasted sharp bile on my tongue. Nothing to do, I decided, but to keep going. I stepped over the line. It was instantly 40 degrees warmer. Forget warmer. Hotter. I felt the sun beating down on my neck, and the glare hurt my eyes. My mouth felt dry, my skin dusty. I would have given anything to still have my climate-controlled supersuit. Volonic folded his arms.
I am not going, and neither is Temret. We'll find another way.
Temret looked at us. She looked at Volonic. She stepped over the line. Volonic opened his mouth. He closed it again, started stammering a little, and finally graduated to coherent words.
You have just directly disobeyed me.
We have to help our friends. You said that Zeke is your brother now. Are you going to abandon him?
Volonic did a bit more stuttering here.
He does not choose to side with me, so I feel no obligation to side with him. I don't want to have to command you to come with me,
he added, his voice sounding like an exasperated parent. Temret met his gaze.
Then don't.
Volonic sighed. He turned around and looked at the rough land behind him, and the city in the distance. Then he glanced up at the jagged line of arid mountains before him. He sighed again and stepped over the line.
We shall speak of this again,
he told her.
Yeah, I kinda figured,
she said. We stood for a moment. No one saying anything. At least the spat between Temret and Volonic had helped get the sight of Charles exploding out of my head. I shrugged, looked at the impossible expanse of desert, and began to walk forward. A beat later, everyone followed, none of us knowing what we were doing or where we were going. The border behind us was a distant blur. The mountains ahead seemed no closer. We were thirsty but determined to ration our moisture packs. Our legs were tired and getting crampy. Walking through sand is much harder than walking on solid ground. I was beginning to regret having talked everyone into this, even though I still couldn't figure out what our alternative might have been. I wanted a moment alone to confer with Smelly, but I hoped that if it had something to tell me, it would pipe up. I had to trust that Smelly didn't want me to die in the desert, and it wouldn't let me die either. Charles had taken to what he called the Mr. Spock role. He'd configured his data bracelet to scan for life, like a tricorder, he said, and every few minutes he waved his arm in an arc across the horizon. We all trudged on, the Colonel the most determined, taking the lead, having to slow himself to keep him from outpacing us. Volonic lagged farthest behind. At first Temret kept pace with him, but somehow, without my noticing, she drifted ahead until she was walking directly next to me. She let her shoulder brush against mine. It was a quick, gliding touch, but even in the desert it felt warm against my shirt.
I'm sorry for what I said before,
she told me, though she didn't meet my eye.
It wasn't fair.
It was fair, I said. That's why it hurt. I promised I'd come for you.
You did, Zeke,
she said.
I was mad because I wished it had been sooner, before things became so complicated, but you did what you said you would. You got me off Rarl.
Like that worked out so well.
You are such an idiot,
she said, now looking right at me.
Don't be mad at yourself because you couldn't find a way to cross the galaxy fast enough. Most people are happy to do the impossible. You want to do it on a schedule.
I almost took her hand, but I held back. I wasn't afraid of Volonic. When it came to Temret, I wasn't afraid of anyone except for Temret herself. Still, I didn't want trouble, especially not here in the desert. I glanced back, and Volonic was staring at us, his eyes narrowed as he struggled to walk faster. Can't you just tell him to get lost? I asked. Maybe more nicely, but you know what I'm saying.
It's not that easy,
she told me.
I can't break my vow. But maybe I can void the contract. Caste customs require particular circumstances to break a marriage promise. But I think there's a way to do that. If we're going to your home, then you can challenge his right to marry by claiming you can provide for his betrothed better. Then you'd have to press your claim.
By doing what?
I probably should have said something before. You might have to fight him?
I glanced back at Volonic again. At the moment, he didn't look like much of a challenge. He looked like a freshly caught fish flopping on the dock. But he was a Rarl, and I was a human. It would be like a moderately athletic turtle fighting the world's wimpiest gorilla. The turtle might give it its all, but in the end, the gorilla smashes him against a rock. Yeah, Tamrat, that's exactly the sort of thing you might have mentioned sooner.
Why?
She asked, looking directly at me.
Would it have made a difference?
I looked back at her, and we both knew the answer. She wanted to get away from Raro. She wanted to go with me. No, I said. I'm not letting you go. Not again. I spoke maybe a little too loudly. Alice, I realized, was listening, and then Tamrat realized it, and the two of them were glowering at each other. I wanted to dig a hole in the sand and bury myself.
This is odd,
Charles said, interrupting my special moment. He stopped walking, and he was studying a text display rising up from his bracelet.
The data bracelet is picking up on two beings about 100 feet in front of us. One humanoid-sized, the other massive.
The colonel put a hand to his eyes. I don't see anything. We all stood there, staring into the empty desert. We saw nothing but sand, and no movement, but that caused by a slight breeze that kicked up small clouds, rippling in the dunes. The reflection of the sun made it hard to look out for long, but I felt sure that if there was a massive creature lumbering out there, we would see it. Volonic caught up with us and planted himself between me and Tamrat. He took her hand, and she let him, but it hung slack in his grip. Then, an inexplicable shift of the sand caught my attention. In one spot, the sand began to swirl and pour downward like a sinkhole had opened far beneath the surface. For a moment, it all stopped, and there was a stillness and quiet. And then the sand shot up, spraying like a geyser. It rained down on us, and the massive thing appeared before us, rising up from below. It was a sandworm. It was a great, big, semi-truck-sized sandworm. I froze in panic. I knew from Frank Herbert's classic novel, Dune, that in addition to having great size, the sandworm was horribly destructive, known to eat any creatures in its path in spite of the fact that it lived in an environment in which there shouldn't have been anything to eat. This one turned towards us, and it didn't look how I'd imagined Frank Herbert's sandworms. It was big and white and grubby looking, yes, with ringed segments so pale they were almost clear. I could see its blue veins, each the size of a tree trunk beneath its thick skin. On its back was a vaguely humanoid figure strapped to some sort of massive saddle. I could tell nothing about the rider because it wore stained white robes and a head covering that revealed no features. All of this was significant, but what made me unafraid was the worm's face, which wasn't what I would have expected from a giant subterranean monster. It looked almost like a dog, the kind you'd want to pet, not flee from in terror. It had a long snout that ended in dozens of undulating whiskers, each no thicker than one of my hairs. It had no eyes, but thick patches of feelers on its forehead. The creature's mouth was long and turned into a natural grin, containing a series of interlocking teeth that formed some kind of filter when its mouth was closed. Now the mouth was open, and the creature spoke.
"Over there!"
it shouted in a deep voice that betrayed a simple kindness.
"Beings! Oh, there are beings! Smell the beings! New beings! Let's meet the beings!"
The cloaked figure patted the worm. The beast began to undulate towards the sand like a snake gliding across the surface of a pond. The worm pulled alongside us like a bus coming to a stop.
"Beings!"
it cried, its voice deep and full of delight.
"New beings come to visit!"
It moved its feelers in our direction.
"Sniffing! Sniffing the beings!"
The rider patted the worm's side. "New beings," agreed the voice, decidedly female. "Good boy." She began to unwrap the scarves from her neck to reveal a head of brown scales, covered with pointy ridges. She looked like a desert lizard from Earth.
Greetings, travelers, she said.
Greetings, Worm Rider,
Steve said.
I am Udlam, daughter of Rakvid. This is no place for outsiders.
It is pretty hot, I agreed. And kind of dry. It could use some roads and maybe a vending machine. Or a rest stop. A rest stop would be nice.
It may be no place for you in particular,
Udlam said. No arguments here, I told her.
What seek you in this place?
Udlam asked. Seek us the hidden fortress, I said. Udlam shook her spiky head.
Another idiot after that hidden fortress. Let's drop the formal talk, okay? I've been on patrol for almost 6 hours, so I'm headed back. You want to ride to my village?
We'd love one, Ducky,
Steve said.
You promise not to cause trouble?
She asked.
We can promise not to intend to cause trouble,
Steve said.
I think that's the best this lot can offer.
Good enough for me.
She reached onto a box embedded into the saddle and threw down a rope ladder.
Climb on up,
She called. Steve nudged me in the side with his elbow.
Oi,
He said, quietly.
she's cute. For an alien.
We rode on top of the worm, whose name was Minty, for almost 3 hours until we came to a settlement alongside a mountain that had produced an overhang, giving the locals some permanent and much-needed shade. The buildings seemed to be carved directly into the cliff face and were accessible through staircases that were also built into the rock. It had a 1970s sci-fi film vibe that I really liked. Not all the inhabitants were the same species as Udlam, though at least half of them were. There was a beetle-like race that walked upright and had a face on its chest. On its head there were a series of tentacles that it used with incredible dexterity. I also saw a few representatives of a small species no more than 3 feet high that were covered with fur the color of the sand and had mouse-like ears. All of the beings in the Forbidden Zone seemed generally friendly to outsiders, though they regarded us with something that I could only describe as exasperation. Why do you live here? I asked Udlam, once we had made it down from the worm. Some of us more gracefully than others. I was one of the others.
Why do you live where you live?
She asked me in a way that made it clear she found the question insulting. That's a fair point, I said. But if I were living in a desert and there was a much more, temperate place only a few miles away, I'd give some thought to moving.
I do not know of this temperate place you speak of, she said. All I know is that this is our home. We've lived here for as long as any of us can remember.
So you have no record of how your people came to the station?
Station?
She asked, sounding genuinely perplexed. I opened my mouth, trying to figure out what to say, but Udlam was already laughing.
Sorry, we always pull that one on newcomers who can't quite seem to figure out why we don't choose to live like they do. Look, we're all desert species. We're comfortable here. It's hot, it's dry, no one bothers us. Out there, it's so humid and cold. Maybe you like it, but it's not for me.
You've been out there? I asked.
Of course. What do you think? We're some primitive savages living on the fringes of civilization because we're too ignorant to make a more civilized choice?
That was exactly what I'd been thinking. Of course not, I assured her.
Why don't you come inside, clean up, and we'll have something to eat?
Udlam said.
You can sleep in our guest rooms for the night, and tomorrow we'll show you the way.
The way to what? I asked.
You want the hidden fortress, right?
She said.
We'll tell you how to get there.
I guess it's not as hidden as advertised,
Steve said.
if you know where it is.
I know where the journey begins,
She said.
After that, I can't tell you much. Supposedly, in my great-grandparents' times, beings came looking for the hidden fortress all the time, 2 or 3 a decade. Things have slowed down since then, but I do know one thing.
Steve grinned at her.
I'll bet you know more than that.
I know one thing that'll scare you silly then. How about that?
Point taken.
Steve conceded.
What's that one thing?
I'm told no one who goes looking for the hidden fortress ever comes back.